Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to the viewers of Radio Islam International on social media. We are joined in our Masjid Alhamdulillah. We're blessed to have Brother Daniel Haqiqatjou traveling from the United States of America on a short visit of South Africa. He's a philosophy student from graduated at Harvard University. He goes by the Muslim Skeptic. He's the founder of Al-Salam Institute, writes lectures on Islam and modernity, and has also been featured in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, CNN, as well as Al Jazeera. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Is that for joining us? Now, tell us about your journey, about how you got to where you are today. What has been instrumental in bringing you to this place, and perhaps some of the motivations and inspirations, whether it be from scholars, whether it be from literature, that sort of formed you onto this particular path and mindset that you have?
Well, I have a background of being raised as a secular Muslim, more liberal Muslim, and it was through the influence of good friends that I encountered in secondary school and tertiary school that, alhamdulillah, influenced me in a positive way. And I studied Islam traditionally with ulama. And one of the big inspirations for me has been the continuous onslaught of the modern world against the Muslims. And this is something that is very oppressive, and I felt that this is something that needs to be counteracted. And so that motivates me to a great deal.
Now, the feminist movements have been causing a lot of uproar in recent time. We've seen some strange concepts being introduced into Islam. And obviously Islam in no way is sexist. There is no real major bias. But we understand that there are certain divine reasons for certain rulings, for certain principles, for the way certain things work. How do we mitigate around the sensitive topic, considering that more liberal people may look at Islam as oppressive if we say certain things or if we caution in certain ways?
Well, of course, we don't accept any of those accusations, but we have to not be defensive about it. In fact, we have to advance Islam as being more just and more moral, more rational than the kind of gender equality that we find within the modern world. I'll give you an example. It's considered to be gender equal in accordance to justice if men and women are mixing together casually. They can have casual friendships, and there's no restriction on that kind of behavior. And this is seen as being in accordance with rationality and morality. But rather than saying that, oh, well, in Islam we have these kinds of rules, it's a little bit different, you have your way, we have ours, it's okay. This is not the approach. We should say that actually what you are doing with your practices, with this kind of culture, this is barbaric, this is irrational, this is immoral. You need to recognize that Islam has something that is far superior in its organization of genders, separating the genders, because it's something obvious to human nature. It's something obvious that any rational person can recognize, that when genders mix, it creates a situation where zina becomes prevalent. And what does zina do? It creates a lot of stress. It causes unplanned pregnancies. It causes children who are born who do not know their fathers, or who cannot truly be sure of who their fathers are, and fathers who don't know who their children truly are. And this causes all kinds of negative spiritual, social, familial, communal consequences that destroy society. And Islam has a clear solution to prevent this kind of harm at every single level when it comes to hijab, when it comes to parda, when it comes to separation of the genders. So not only should we reject what is being forced on us by this modern hegemony, by this feminist value system, we should critique and undermine their value system to show how clearly Islam is superior to what they offer.
When it comes to the issue of homosexuality, the LGBTQ movement, we always see religious groups, especially primarily Christian religious groups, that are very vocal against it. Do we see enough of this happening from the side of the Muslims? Do we see enough Muslim organizations being vocal, about the stance that Islam has on this type of behavior and on the fact that it is forbidden?
I think that there are vocal individuals and vocal ulama, especially, who speak out. I think that the community needs to support and encourage speaking out and being clear on this issue without compromise, with the full conviction that Islam is providing guidance on these areas of life and on every area of life. So yeah, I think that we should encourage speaking out on these issues more and more.
When it comes to modernization, we see that in recent times Muslims adopt certain tradition or certain culture. They use maybe phrases during the holiday season. They adopt a particular type of dressing, maybe during a festive period. They attend certain types of events. Somewhat it's done in the guise of playing proverbial catch-up. Now, what's the effective way into, or rather to assimilate into a multi-religious, a multicultural society without bordering on something that could be transgression, or without sacrificing the moral fibers of our deen?
This is a perennial question, and I think it's very possible at this point in time, in most countries, not all, for Muslims to be able to live without having to assimilate and adopt all of these kinds of cultural practices that contradict Islam. I think it's possible. Will it be possible in the future? Allahu A'lam. We don't know what can happen, because at any moment, this is the nature of the modern secular state. At any moment it can clamp down and force Muslims to change and to oppress Muslims in such a way that Muslims really can't live. And we pray that that day doesn't come, but we have to be aware that there isn't this kind of guarantee. There's nothing that's guaranteed in these countries that Muslims are living as long as there is a non-Muslim authority. That being said, I have lived in the West my whole life, and alhamdulillah I've been able to practice Islam. There's been a lot of pressures, and there are aspects of Islam that obviously I can't practice, my family can't practice, but alhamdulillah there are obligations that cannot be done. You can eat halal, you can marry, you can have children, you can pray, but the restrictions are getting more and more and more. In some countries they have banned circumcision. A parent can't decide for his child to circumcise. The hijab in some Western countries has been banned. Halal meat in some Western countries has been banned. And these are going to continue to cause pressure for the Muslims until a point where perhaps even the obligations of Islam can no longer be, the individual obligations of Islam can no longer be practiced. So what kind of religious freedom, so-called, in the secular state exists? It's never existed. It's an incoherent concept, but we have to be aware of this kind of dynamic.
Islamophobia and stereotypes, certain types of stigmas, are being attached to Muslims globally. Sometimes we also see people accusing certain groupings, accusing people of castigating individuals when they are cautioning them or warning them that they're contradicting maybe the Prophet ﷺ's teachings. How do we navigate this when you try and sort of maintain the boundaries of Sharia, you maintain the boundaries of Deen, but it's constantly just being blasted, if you could put it that way, from every direction?
Who cares about what people call you? You can't fear the blame of the blamers. You just have to speak the truth, and you have to call to the way of your Lord with wisdom, with hikmah, and maw'idatul hasanah, with goodly counsel. So that's a given. You have to expect that there's going to be conflicts. You have to expect that there's going to be people who won't like what you have to say and are going to push back. That's inevitable. If you think that you can speak the truth and follow Islam without any conflict and without any pushback, then you don't really recognize what Islam is. So we have to be aware of that so it's not surprising, and we don't self-censor and silence ourselves to prevent a kind of situation that is inevitable, it's necessary, and it's very easy to get beyond. Ultimately, name-calling is a sign of someone who doesn't have a real position, a real argument. They have to resort to calling you names because they can't argue with your position. So this is a sign that even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quraysh and the Mushrikeen, they couldn't address all the arguments coming from the Quran. And so they had to call the Prophet ﷺ crazy, they had to call him all kinds of names because they couldn't deal with him and the divine revelation in a rational way, because they're completely overpowered by its rationality, its beauty, and its power. So same thing in our time, in the modern day.
Get with the times is perhaps all too commonly used nowadays in many different parts of the world. How do we realize and remind each other about the fact that the Prophet ﷺ's teaching, the Quran, all of the injunctions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set out for us, is something that is timeless, is something that will constantly be relevant regardless of the era that we live in?
Well, this is something that we can know, that Islam is for all times and all people. We can know it theoretically, but how do we really feel that? And there are many examples and signs in the world today. One being the Me Too movement, and you had all of this kind of conflict in non-Muslim society, where you had sexual harassment, you had kind of abuse of power. So what creates that situation? And you recognize, many people recognize, non-Muslims, that, well, maybe men and women shouldn't be alone together, or maybe men and women need to limit their interactions, not touch each other, not shake hands. You had non-Muslims in the corporate world recognizing this. Well, this is all found in Islam. This is all of these guidelines, all these values that you claim to discover now because of all the horrible consequences that you face, we have had in Islam. So this is a sign that of Islam's timelessness, that Islam is from the creator of human beings, and he knows us as human beings and has sent guidance for us as human beings. And anyone who tries to come up with a moral system or a way of life or a culture that's just man-made on the assumption, the speculation of his own mind is going to be misguided. This is very clear, and there's so many examples that we see over and over and over again in history that repeats itself with this message.
When we look at the development of over-modern or liberal thinking, there's sort of two factors that could possibly be to blame or be responsible. One is obviously the secular systems that are designed to somewhat change impressionable younger mindsets in Muslim communities, so in communities at large. The other is also sometimes factors that come from the way just the dynamics of the world have changed. People are more busy, they perhaps don't have enough time to sit in these kinds of gatherings or even bring those values into the lives of their children or the lives of their family members for that matter. Is there a leaning towards either side being more responsible for this mindset shift, or is it both to blame, and how do we tackle both of these situations and ensure that mindset change is something that we can stop or something that we can heal from here on forward?
So the two factors are the secular system and Muslims themselves. Who's more responsible? Well, it's the secular system. It's these liberal values that are being imposed, are forcing Muslims to change their way that they teach, change the way that they raise children. So I guess Muslims have a responsibility to resist that to the best of their ability. But if you have someone that is being oppressed and brainwashed and indoctrinated, then I put the majority of the blame on the attacker, on the tyrant.
Brother Daniel, the final question I have for you is that there are many different groupings, not only in South Africa. I'm sure this is something that exists in many different parts of the world. And there are some groups who demonize other groups for their ideas, for their thoughts, for maybe their way of thinking. Are these kinds of reactions sort of sparking the more liberal thinkers to spur maybe Muslim liberals to act in a different way or to push their agenda more and more to create this disunity, this divisiveness in the Muslim societies or in Muslim communities?
I'm not a scholar, so I just follow, and I can't comment on differences within fiqh between different scholars. I think that just from what I've seen, you have valid ikhtilaf on certain issues and valid opinions. That the difference in opinion is not because of a liberal ideology. It's just this difference exists in the fiqh. And I think that if we allow those kinds of issues to create a sharp divide, we won't be able to address the major issues that are just constantly attacking the Muslim community. It's like the house is on fire and we're quibbling and arguing about some of these issues that it's already been addressed, it's already been discussed for years, decades, generations, and is there going to be a final resolution that this is the only correct answer? We've always had ikhtilaf within the Muslim community, and it's a matter of working together despite the valid ikhtilaf. I'm not saying that those differences are wrong or there shouldn't be discussion. Yes, but it's limited to specialists who collaborate and they discuss and they debate and they work together. But for the vast majority of the community, this is not something that is going to really move the needle with the issues that they're facing. When you're facing a situation where your children are being taught that zina is a perfectly viable option for you, and homosexuality is a perfectly viable option for you, and something that you should love and respect and celebrate, our children are being forced to learn this in schools at the age of 6, 7, 8. So how are we addressing that? If we can solve that and address that issue that is everyone agrees is a complete disaster, then once that issue is resolved and those other issues, then we can as a community also maybe work on issues of ikhtilaf. But for now, those kinds of discussions can be limited to specialists, and everyone else needs to just follow and be concerned about those things that are immediately impacting the iman, at the level of iman of the Muslims.
Brother Daniel, Jazakallah khairan for availing your time and chatting to us. We hope to perhaps speak to you again sometime in the future.
Inshallah.
يا لا لا يا لا لا